All right, the story of the Old Testament, part number 3. We're going to look at the topic of God's judgment and his mercy as we see those attributes of God's character after the fall. Last video, we were looking at the story of creation and the fall. So if you missed that, the playlist is in the link in the description of this video down below. So you can go check that out, as well as part 1 of this series. That's an overview of what we are going to find in the Old Testament literature. But today, part number 3, we're going to be looking at the story of God's judgment and his mercy in response to man's depravity after the fall. And so in this video, we are going to be looking at 3 stories as it relates to this particular topic. Now, my goal with this series is to give you an overarching view of what the story of the Old Testament is. So each video is kind of like the next episode in that overarching story. I don't just want to go over the stories that you'll find in the Old Testament. I want you to know where they fit within the full timeline of the Old Testament story. So that's what we're going to be looking at over the course of this series. I've got this particular video and then the next 2 planned out as well. I'm a little bit behind on getting those up, but we'll hopefully get caught up here soon. All right, so God's judgment and mercy after the fall. Now, a little bit of a note on this. We often think of God's judgment and his mercy as being opposites. They are 2 things that are not related. Most of the time in our life, we would rather see God's judgment. In our lives, we would rather see God's mercy. In other people's lives, we would rather see God's judgment. We want him to be fair and want him to administer justice and all that in other people's lives, where we want grace and mercy in ours. But we're going to look at how in God's character, both of these attributes are present and they balance each other out, and they are both present at the same time. As God is giving judgment, his mercy is also there, and as God gives mercy, his justice and his judgment are also there as well. We're going to look at 3 stories, like I said. The first is the story of how Cain killed his brother Abel. We'll look at that story. We'll also look at the story of Noah and the flood, how Noah built an ark, and then we'll also look at the story of the Tower of Babel, or Tower of Babylon, depending on your translation. And in each of these stories, we're going to look at the text, just read it, get it loaded in our brains. We'll look at it, derive some things from it, and see God's judgment and his mercy in each one of these situations. Each of these stories in the Old Testament that was part of the overall story of the Old Testament. We're going to start off in Genesis chapter 4, looking at the story of how Cain killed his brother Abel. So verse number 1 says, "The man was intimate with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, 'I have had a male child with the Lord's help.' She also gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground. In the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard or honored or respected for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you furious, and why do you look despondent? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it.' Cain said to his brother Abel, 'Let's go out to the field.' And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's guardian?' Then he said, 'What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed, alienated from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have shed. If you work the ground, it will never again give you its yield. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." I want to make sure. Yeah, I don't know why on is cut off there. Sorry. But Cain answered the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear, since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." Then the Lord replied to him, "In that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And he placed a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. Then Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay, so there is the story of Cain and Abel. I'm going to leave it up there on your screen as I talk about it for just a little bit. So in last week's video, we looked at how, or the last video, it wasn't last week, it was several weeks ago that I put that up. But if you're watching this sometime later, it doesn't matter, the previous video, we looked at the story of creation and the fall. And after the fall, Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden. And after that, they have a son, and they named him Cain. Eve names him Cain. And then after that, they have another son named Abel. So Cain and Abel, first set of siblings that we have in the Bible. We see that Cain becomes a worker of the ground. He becomes a farmer, essentially. So Cain worked the ground. He just means that he was a farmer. And Abel, though, was a shepherd. So we have 2 different roles, 2 different things that they were doing. Both are working in that kind of way. They both bring offerings to the Lord. Okay, so far we kind of have this parallel between Cain and Abel. So Cain is born first, then we have Abel. Cain becomes a farmer, but Abel becomes a shepherd of the flocks. And then they both bring offerings to the Lord. Cain brings offering from the ground, the passage, and I'll just put that right back up. Cain presented some of the land's, over highlighting. He presented some of the land's produce as an offering. We're not told exactly what this offering was, what it consisted of, what exactly Cain brought, but we just see that Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord. Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. So we get here some of a better idea of what Abel's offering consisted of, in that it was the firstborn of his flock. It was the first ones that were born, and obviously that's what firstborn means. So it was the very beginning of his gain, or what his profit would have been. So some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. So that's what he offers as a offering to the Lord. And then the passage says that God had regard for Abel's offering. He respects his offering, but he doesn't respect Cain's offering. Now, the text is not immediately clear on why Abel's offering was accepted while Cain's was not. There's a couple of different possibilities. It could have been, had something to do with a lack of faith, perhaps, on Cain's part. In the book of Hebrews, Abel is said to be a man of faith, that by faith he offered a sacrifice, offered a offering to God. So maybe Cain offered his offering, but lacked sufficient faith. That's a possibility. It could have been something to do with the motives with which they offered the sacrifices. If Abel is offering his offering to God with a motivation of worship or right motives, or maybe Cain did it begrudgingly. He didn't really want to, but he's just like, okay, yeah, here's some of my fruit, first fruits, or some of the fruit of the my produce. Maybe his motives just weren't good. It's also possible that actually what Cain offered was just not as good as what Abel offered, in the sense that what Abel offered was the firstborn of his flock, where it doesn't make it clear that what Cain offered was the first fruits of what he had grown. But regardless, there was some reason why God respected Abel's offering and did not have regard for Cain's offering. But what's clear is that since God did not have regard for Cain and his offering, Cain was furious. He's angry. He's upset. He's really mad. I don't know how else to put this. He's furious. Okay, he becomes angry. And so God comes and has this conversation with Cain, which I think is super interesting. He's like, why are you so upset? Like, why are you angry? What's going on? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? And it's this rhetorical question where he's like, if you did the right thing, don't you think that you'd be accepted? So why don't you just do the right thing? God promises Cain that he would be accepted if he did the right thing. He says, if you do what's right, you'll be accepted. And so obviously Cain's sacrifice is not presented in the right way. Something wrong with how he presents his sacrifice. God also warns Cain about sin lying at the door. So let's look at right down there in verse number 7. He says, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. He's saying sin is really close. There is, you are right there on the verge of heading down this slippery slope of doing the wrong thing, of falling further. And so God warns Cain. And I think it's important to point out that warning itself is a sign of mercy. Parents do this all the time where they warn their children, hey, be careful, that stove is hot, don't touch the stove. And that warning is merciful in the sense that they don't want their child to burn themselves on the stove. They want them to back away, want them to do the right thing and not touch the hot stove. That's a merciful thing as opposed to just letting your child burn themselves, hurt themselves. And so God gives this warning to Cain, and that in and of itself is an act of mercy. Cain then takes his brother out to the field. So he says to his brother, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So, first murder in the Bible. God asks Cain where his brother is. Verse 9, the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? I think it's super interesting how that God has this pattern, especially in the first few chapters of Genesis, where he asks questions that are designed to bring repentance. Notice that like Cain could have responded with, yeah, you know what, God, I messed up. I was angry. I was upset that you accepted his offering, but didn't accept my offering. And so while we were out here in the field, I got angry and I killed my brother. I don't know what I'm going to do. I need you to forgive me, offer me mercy, whatever the situation might be. But he could have just admitted and confessed to doing what was wrong. And that's the design of this question, is he is asking, God asks Cain, where is your brother Abel? But instead of repenting, Abel replies, first of all, with a lie. He says, I don't know. Okay, yeah, Cain did know, obviously. He's exactly where you left him because you killed him. And then he also adds this really cruel, apathetic statement where he says, am I my brother's guardian? Am I my brother's guardian? This is such a cruelly apathetic statement or question. And the fact of the matter is that well, if he was his brother's guardian, he's not a very good one because he killed him, right? Cain is just in the wrong here, 100%. And so then God responds with punishment. We look there in the next verse. God says, what have you done? Your brother's blood, it cries out to me from the ground. So now, as a result of what you have done, as a result of your having murdered your brother, there's going to be punishment. First thing he says is, so now you are cursed, alienated from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have shed. If you work the ground, it will never again give you its yield. It's never going to yield fruit for you like it used to. And so God cursed Cain from the ground. And he also said that you're going to be a restless wanderer. Cain responds with a complaint. He answers God and says, "My punishment is too great to bear. This is unfair, not okay." He says, "Since you are banishing me today from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth, whoever finds me will kill me." So Cain complains about the situation, but he never repents. So this is a major problem in Cain's life. Even in that, though, God offers mercy. He says, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And so he places a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. And so there we see how God shows mercy by protecting Cain from a vengeful death. So God cursed Cain. There's punishment, but God also offers mercy as well. We'll dive into that just a little bit more at the end when we draw some conclusions. But horribly sad story of how Cain killed his brother Abel simply because Abel did the right thing. And Cain didn't. He had the opportunity to change, but didn't. Now, that was in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. The rest of chapter 4 has to do with Cain and his family, and then goes on to talk about how Adam and his wife Eve had another child named Seth, and then chapter 5 then goes on to give the genealogy of Adam's line through Seth, and then on down to Noah, which is where we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 6. And let's start with verse number 5. Let me put that up on your screen. Okay, verse number 5 says, "When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I created, off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them." So this introduction to the story shows the sobering reality of the sinfulness of man. And in fact, very quickly after the fall, to be clear, to be fair, there are 10 generations, I believe it is, between Adam and Noah. There's quite a bit of time happening here, especially because, as we see in chapter 5, there are the people that are living very, very long lives. But still, relatively quickly after the fall, we see humanity's descent into just total depravity. The first thing we see Cain and Abel doing is Cain killing his brother. Just horrible wickedness in humanity. And so in just a few short chapters, the Old Testament story makes it clear that humanity desperately needs God's mercy and grace. We see how in Genesis 1 and 2, God created the world perfect. It was good. It was exactly the way he wanted it to be. And then here we are in Genesis chapter 6, and God sees that human wickedness was widespread. It's not just a little problem, it's a major problem. Every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time. So major problems for humanity. But then verse 8 is a welcome change from the previous ones. It says, Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. Noah was a bright spot in the wickedness that was humanity. And then in verse 9, we see some things about Noah. These are the family records of Noah, verse 9. Noah was a righteous man. Again, over highlighting. Right, righteous man. He's blameless. I'm going to just keep doing this. Blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. And then Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So a few things that we see here is that, number 1, we see that Noah pleased God. He found favor with God. We see that in verse 8. Found favor with God, with the Lord. He was righteous in the sight of God. So he was a righteous man. And then also, I think what's really important is that he was blameless among his contemporaries, which means that he had a reputation of being blameless, of just being a good guy, and that nobody could just bring accusations against Noah. He was a good guy. And then number 4 about Noah, we see that he enjoyed fellowship with God. He walked with God. And so he made a priority of following God, walking with him, and fellowshipping with him. So Noah's example here in Genesis chapter 6 shows us that it is possible to please God even when encircled by sin. And so none of us can say, based off of Noah's example, that no, there's no way that I can live for God because you just don't understand the home that I grew up in, or there's no way that I could live for God because you just don't know the school that I go to, or the neighborhood that I live in, or the friends that I have, the job that I have, the people that I work with, and so I can't stand up for God because I'm just surrounded by wickedness, sin all the time. Noah is proof that it is possible to please God, to live a life that God accepts, even when encircled by sin. Doesn't mean we're going to be perfect. Let me be careful to clarify that. Doesn't mean that we can be sinlessly perfect. But we can live a life where we can please God by faith, which Hebrews tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God. All right, let's jump down to verse 11. And we'll see how God has Noah build the ark. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with wickedness. God saw how corrupt the earth was, for every creature had corrupted its way on the earth. Then God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore, I am going to destroy them along with the earth. So here's the instructions that he gives to Noah. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it with pitch inside and outside. This is how you are to make it. The ark will be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. You are to make a roof, finishing the sides of the ark to within 18 inches of the roof. You are to put a door in the side of the ark. Make it with lower, middle, and upper decks. Understand that I am bringing a flood waters on the earth to destroy every creature under heaven with the breath of life in it. And let me see if I can, there we go. Should make it to where you can see that without it cutting off anymore. Where was I at? The breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. Verse 18. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. You are also to bring into the ark 2 of all the living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of everything, from the birds according to their kinds, from the livestock according to their kinds, and from the animals that crawl on the ground according to their kinds, will come to you so that you can keep them alive. Take with you every kind of food that is eaten, gather it as food for you and for them. And Noah did this. He did everything that God had commanded him. All right, so here are the commandments that God gives to Noah about how to build the ark. You can see that all there. The instructions that Noah then has to follow. Then let's jump forward to chapter 7. All right, verse number 1. We're going to read the first 5 verses here. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. You are to take with you 7 pairs, a male and its female, of all the clean animals, and 2 of the animals that are not clean, a male and its female, and 7 pairs, male and female, of the birds of the sky, in order to keep offspring alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now, I will make it rain on the earth. 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing I have made, I will wipe off the face of the earth. And Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him. I think it's important to just point out that how often it says that Noah did everything that God commanded him. He doesn't falter on anything, doesn't hesitate. He just follows God's instructions. Now, the account of the flood, as we see here how Noah then enters into the ark, is a emphasis of Noah's obedience. Look at this in verse 1. God said to Noah to enter the ark. He gives him instructions about the animals to take with them in verse 2, all of that. But then in verse 4, it says, 7 days from now, I will make it rain on the earth. So God tells Noah, go ahead and get in the ark. But then says that 7 days from now, I'm going to make it rain. Just picture this scene for a little bit. Just picture what this would have looked like. Noah, his family, and all the animals are inside this massive ark that he just spent 120 years building. And he stays there for 7 days before the rains come, showing Noah sticking to his commitment to follow God's instructions. Think about this. Noah and his family and all the animals are staying on the ark for 7 days, which just demonstrates how Noah is committed to following God in everything they told him to do. There's people outside mocking, laughing, ridiculing them, calling them names probably, thinking that they're just stupid. And Noah is here in this massive boat. There's no water around for miles. And he said that he's doing this because it's going to rain, which it had never done up to that point. Up to that point, the God had made the water, had watered the ground by having a mist come up and water the ground. So that's how things grew that way. But it had never rained. And so Noah is introducing this brand new idea to everybody, and people are thinking that he's crazy. People are outside mocking and laughing, rejecting the truth that God was mercifully granting them another week of life. They could have repented. They could have chosen to believe and gotten in the ark with Noah, but they don't. I mentioned last time, I think it was the last video, I believe so, that I want to, my goal is to mention and just to point out every time when we get through the Old Testament, every time there's a picture of Jesus. I believe that the entire Bible points to Jesus. Jesus is the main character. He's what it's all about. And so the ark here is a picture of Jesus. First of all, there's one door. Notice how we could go back to chapter 6. And I'll put it up here on your screen. Verse number 16. So we're right here. It says, you are to make a roof finishing the sides. And it says, you are to put a door in the side of the ark. There's one door. And just how Jesus is one way back to God. There's only one way. Jesus is the door. And that analogy is even put through in the New Testament as well. And then notice how all those who were in the ark were saved from judgment. If you were in the ark, you were safe from the flood. Outside the ark, outside the ark, you are obviously not safe from the judgment from the flood. And all of those of us who are in Christ, who are in Jesus, are safe from eternal judgment. And so the ark here is a beautiful picture of Jesus here in the Old Testament. And then looking in the rest of Genesis chapter 7, we see the story of the flood and all that takes place there. And then we're going to jump forward to Genesis chapter 8, and when they get off of the ark, again, just trying to give you an overview of these stories, not wanting to spend too much time in each one. And I'm also trying to make this a somewhat of a shorter video after the last couple have been a little bit longer. But Genesis chapter 8, verse 15, I should put that up there for you. Then God spoke to Noah, come out of the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives with you. Bring out all the living creatures that are with you, birds, livestock, those that crawl on the earth, and they will spread over the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Okay, so coming out of the ark, let's jump down then to chapter 9. God is making a covenant with Noah. That's what we're looking at. Let's jump down to verse number 8 in chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, understand that I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, birds, livestock, and all wildlife of the earth that are with you, all the animals of the earth that came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again will every creature be wiped out by floodwaters. So that's the covenant that God is making. And never again will every creature be wiped out by a flood. So then God promises clearly there will never again be a flood to destroy the earth as a whole, the earth as a whole. Sorry if that is making noise in your ear every time I hit that. Verse 12, and God said, this is the sign of the covenant. God always likes to make a sign for the covenants that he makes. This is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you. A covenant for all future generations. Catch that? All future generations. I really should be careful about over-highlighting everything. Maybe it doesn't bother you, but it bugs me every time I do that. All future generations, that's a key thing. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. The bow will be in the clouds, and I will look at it and remember the permanent covenant between God and all the living creatures on earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and every creature on earth. So God makes this covenant with Noah. Again, now the flood is a sign of God's judgment. Remember, we're keeping judgment and mercy in view. That's what we're looking at. The flood, obviously, is God's judgment on mankind. Their sin was so great. Their thoughts were nothing but evil all the time. So God sends the flood. But then here is a sign of God's mercy. He gives this promise represented by the rainbow in the clouds that never again would God destroy the world with a flood. So although humanity is totally depraved, even though we are completely wicked and sinful people, God has promised that never again will he destroy the whole earth with a flood. This covenant that we just looked at in chapter, in a few verses there in chapter 8 and then also in chapter 9, this covenant is unconditional, which means that God has bound himself alone to ensure that the covenant is kept. It's not up to us. It wasn't up to Noah. It wasn't up to anybody to do anything to keep it. It was a unilateral agreement that God by himself is saying, this is what's going to happen. This is the promise that I'm going to keep. And there's nothing that can change that. It's an unconditional covenant. Okay, so far we have looked at the story of Cain and Abel. We've looked at the we looked at the flood. Now we're going to look at the Tower of Babel. That is going to be found in Genesis chapter 11. There's a few other things that happen with Noah and his family in end of chapter 9 and 10. Chapter 11 is where we're going to get the story of the Tower of Babel or Tower of Babylon, again, depending on your translation. Let me bring you over here. We're going to read verses 1 through 9. Again, just getting it loaded in our brain. We're going to look at some things from it, and then we'll look at God's judgment and mercy in each of these. And then we'll be done. So a little bit of a shorter video today, I think. All right, the verse number 1. The whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. Okay, so at this point, everyone has the same language, spoke everything the same way. Verse 2. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let us make oven-fired bricks. They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered through the earth. So notice those three things. There's three motivators here. We're going to look at these a little bit closer in just a moment. But They said, let's build a city and a tower that reaches up into heaven. Motive number one, goal number one. Number two, let's make a name for ourselves. And then number three, the concern was we're going to be scattered throughout the earth. Let's do this thing. Let's come together. Let's join together. Let's do this. And sorry, I'm punching my microphone, which can't sound great to you. All right, so notice those two things. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Verse 5. Then the Lord came down to look over the city. Notice this. They're trying to build this city, tower, to reach heaven, but still God comes down to visit it, which says that they had a long way to go. Then the Lord came down to look over the city and the tower that the humans were building. The Lord said, if they have begun to do this as one people, all having the same language, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. In other words, all of the messed up, all of the sinful, wicked things that man could dream up to do, there'll be nothing to stop them. They're going to continue to just get worse and worse again. Verse 7. Come, let's go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. So from there, the Lord scattered them throughout the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, it is called Babylon, or Babel. Goes by both names, but just so you understand, this is where Babylon comes from. Therefore, it is called Babylon, for there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them throughout the earth. Remember, I said that there were three motives, and we see those here in verse 4. So I keep those highlighted up there on your screen for you to look at while we talk about it. So this proposed tower that they wanted to build was to serve three purposes. Number one, the people wanted its top to reach heaven. Now, it's important to recognize that these people were not genuinely trying to reach the true God. Like, they weren't like building this tower thinking like, if we build this tower, we can like take a shortcut. We don't have to die. We can just build this tower to reach heaven and reach God. But in all likelihood, they were actually worshiping false deities based around the sun, moon, stars, planets, etc. And so their thinking was they could build a tower to reach up to the heavens, meaning where the sun and moon, stars, and other planets are. So they weren't really worshiping the true God. Secondly, they wanted to make a name for themselves. Let me see. There we go. Number 2. They want to make a name for themselves. Okay. So obviously there are some selfish motivators at play here. Let us make a name for ourselves. People today have the same selfish motivations. So let me be a little bit controversial. We use that phrase today, and usually we are not using that phrase in a negative sense. Like, God is looking at this as this is a negative thing. They said, let us make a name for ourselves. And it's obvious the arrogance and the pride that was so pervasive for these people that are building this tower in this statement. They're like, we want to be well known. We want to make a name for ourselves. So let's build this tower. Let's do this thing. And people today have the same kind of selfish motivations. We'll use that phrase like, this person's they're just trying to get ahead. They're just trying to make a name for themselves in whatever field they work in. And let me just say, if that's your main motivator for doing things in life is to just make a name for yourself. That is not a good motivation. Because it's just selfish. And it's self-focused, and that's not good. And then third, they didn't want to be scattered throughout the earth. That's the last concern, their last motive for why they were wanting to build this tower. They ended up failing on that one. So God came down and he stopped their work by confusing the languages. This is, again, God's judgment. So the people were selfishly motivated. They were trying to. This is a false worship that they were engaged in. Um, and uh, and so God comes down and stops their work and confuses their languages. So that's God's judgment. But this act is also merciful, because imagine how much rebellion would have developed had the people continued to live as one people. And let me illustrate it this way. For those of you that have kids, perhaps there have been times where you, especially if you got more than one kid, maybe most of the time they do well together, they play well together, they get along well together. But there are some times where they're just not getting along. They're fussing at each other. They're fighting, and this is a problem, right? And so what you'll do is you'll say, okay, you go to your room, you go to your room, you guys need to be separated for a while. And the reason why you're separating them is because you don't want them to continue to get worse and for this to escalate to a point where bad things happen. And so as a parent, in your wisdom, you decide, hey, it's a good idea for these two to be separated. Or for another example, again, involving kids. You may look at the people that or the type of people that your child is hanging out with, the kind of friends that they have at school or what have you. And you may step in and make decisions and put some things in place to keep one of your children from being around someone else that you think might possibly be a bad influence on your child, or at the very least, the two of them, when they get together, it's just not good. They are misbehaving. They do the wrong thing. They make the wrong choices. And so to avoid that, you separate them. That's what God is doing here. And this is an act of mercy. Your kids probably don't recognize that when you are separating them or when you're telling them, no, I don't want you hanging out with that person. But you know the potential harm that these two people, these two individuals being around each other, how much harm that might potentially cause, and so you choose to separate them. That's what God is doing here, to avoid the level of rebellion that would have developed had the people all continued to live as one people with one language together like that. All right, as we wrap this up, let's look at how in each of these stories we see God's judgment and his mercy going hand in hand. So first of all, the story of Cain. God's judgment in that situation was that the ground would not produce fruit for Cain. Cain killed his brother. And so the fact that there was some judgment involved probably shouldn't surprise us. Like, that makes sense, right? That was God's judgment. But his mercy was that God didn't take Cain's life. Cain took his brother's life, and so we could look at that and say, hey, if God is being just and fair, maybe Cain should have also died because of the loss of life that Cain took there. But God didn't do that. He spared Cain and didn't immediately kill him. Not only that, but God also then protects Cain from those who might be seeking revenge on Cain. So God protects him. That's God's mercy at play. In Noah and the flood, God's judgment was that God destroyed the world with the flood. But in his mercy, God spared Noah and his family, provided a way out. He didn't just kill everybody and start all over with like a new Adam and Eve. God made a covenant then after that not to flood the earth again. That is God's mercy. God's mercy. And then in the Tower of Babel, or Tower of Babylon, God's judgment is that God confused the languages and made the people separate. And so basically what's happening is that each person, each group of same languages would then find each other, and imagine like how exciting it must be, like after not like being able to talk to anybody for a little while, that then they could finally find somebody that they can talk to. And so then they would become a people. And that happened. And so that judgment stopped the building of the tower because they couldn't communicate. And so that was God's judgment. But in his mercy, God didn't destroy humanity despite how wicked they were and how self-focused they were. And then again, as we talked about just a moment ago, God protected humanity from worse corruption by making them separate out into smaller groups, to keep them from just their rebellion growing at an exponential rate. So here's the application for us. When God punishes us for our sin, we need to humbly realize that he is also offering us mercy at the same time. His judgment and his mercy go hand in hand. They go together. They are joined together. God is holy. We've talked about this before. God is holy. He is perfect. He is, and because of that, he has to be just. He has to administer justice. And when sin is committed, God has to treat that sin seriously because it's a serious thing. But God also offers mercy at the same time. And we should recognize that in our lives. We should realize that no matter how harsh the punishment, the judgment might seem to us, we should recognize that God is also offering us mercy as well. His grace and his mercy go hand in hand with his judgment, his justice. And as he administers judgment, as he acts justly, he is also offering us mercy as well. And we see that in each of these stories. The story of Cain and Abel, the story of Noah and the flood, and the story of the Tower of Babel. Next time, we're going to look at evidence of God's faithfulness. God promises many things. Does God keep his promises? And we're going to do that by looking at the patriarchs. We'll look at Abraham and Sarah. We will look at, we'll look at Abraham and Sarah. We'll look at Isaac. We'll look at Jacob, who then is renamed as Israel, Joseph. Look at all of them. In our next videos, we'll look at God's faithfulness next time. But this is the story of the Old Testament. We'll continue that with part 4 next time. Let's pray, and then that'll be it for today's video. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the fact that you do give justice, that you are a just God, that you are fair, you are good. And so because of that, we then, when we sin, we do deserve a fair and just judgment. But at the same time, you are also merciful. You are gracious. And oftentimes you don't, you offer us mercy and grace at the same time as giving us judgment as well. So I pray that you'd help us to recognize that. Help us to realize that in our lives as we face judgment for our sin, we would recognize that you are also offering mercy and grace at the same time. And help us to recognize that and thank you for your mercy and grace, even when we are facing judgment for our sin. And we'll give you the honor and praise for it. We thank you for your word. Help us to apply it to our lives where it needs to be applied. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.